There is a version of quitting that feels like freedom. You walk out, you don't look back, you tell yourself you finally did it. And for about 72 hours, that feeling is real. Then the silence comes. The people who smiled at you every morning stop texting. The manager who called you a key player doesn't respond to your LinkedIn message 6 weeks later. The colleagues you ate lunch with every day for 3 years send you one congratulations message and then disappear into a version of the world you no longer have access to. And somewhere around day 5 or 6, a very specific kind of panic sets in. Not about money, not yet, but about who exactly you are without that place telling you every morning where to be, what to wear, and what your day is supposed to look like. This is the part nobody warns you about. Not because it's a secret, but because the people who experienced it don't want to admit it. Admitting it would mean admitting that the job they hated was doing more for them than they realized. That the structure they complained about over drinks was quietly managing their identity, their sense of purpose, their feeling of being needed in the world. And men, especially men who built their self-image around finally having the courage to walk away, do not want to sit with that truth. Most men who quit their jobs do it wrong. Not because they lack courage. Leaving takes courage. They do it wrong because they treat the exit like it's the end of something, when it is actually the most dangerous opening move of the next chapter of their life. And they make that move emotionally charged, financially underprepared, socially exposed, and with no understanding of what they are about to hand away. Machiavelli was not a man who believed in dramatic exits. He spent years studying what happens when rulers abandon positions in moments of emotion, what happens to their alliances, their resources, their reputations, their options. And what he found, again and again, was not liberation. It was vulnerability dressed up as principle. He wrote that a man who exits without first securing his next position doesn't gain freedom. He creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by whoever is most prepared to fill them. That is almost never the man who just walked out feeling righteous about his decision. This video is not about whether you should quit. That decision is yours, and it belongs to no one else. This is about what happens in the window between your decision and your departure, and why that window is the most politically loaded, strategically important period of your entire professional life. Most men waste it completely. They spend it venting to coworkers, mentally checking out, doing the bare minimum, counting down days like a prison sentence. The few who understand what that window actually is, what it contains, what it makes possible, walk out of jobs the same way experienced generals retreat from territory, deliberately, with everything valuable already repositioned, and with the other side still confused about what exactly just happened. What you are about to hear is not motivation. It is mechanics. And the difference between the man who quits with his power intact and the man who quits with nothing but a story about how he finally stood up for himself is almost entirely in the details that follow. The first thing you need to understand, really understand, not just nod at, is what the emotional exit actually costs, not philosophically. In practical, measurable, career-altering terms, when a man quits out of emotion, out of a bad performance review, a public humiliation in a meeting, a moment where his manager spoke to him like he was invisible, and something finally snapped, he exits at his absolute weakest point. The circumstances of his exit become the frame through which every future conversation about him gets filtered. He was a good worker, yes, but he left badly. He was talented, sure, but he burned out. He had potential, definitely, but he couldn't handle pressure. These are not things people say out loud at the time. They are things that get said quietly, 6 months later, when someone calls for a reference and the former manager pauses just slightly too long before answering. The emotional exit feels powerful in the moment because it is the one moment where you stop performing patience. For months or years, you have been managing your reactions, suppressing your frustration, choosing your words carefully, playing the long game inside an environment that was not rewarding you for any of it. And then one day, you stop. You say what you actually think. You let your face show what it really feels. And for a few hours, maybe a few days, that honesty feels like strength. It isn't. What it actually is the removal of the one thing that was protecting you, composure. The second your composure drops, every person in that building who was neutral about you is forced to pick a side, and they do not pick yours. They cannot afford to. You are leaving. They are staying. Their mortgage, their health insurance, their next promotion, all of it lives inside the building you just made a scene in. Of course they side with the institution. You would have done the same thing 2 years ago. There is also the identity crash, and this one is worth spending real time on because it catches almost everyone off guard. You have spent months or years inside a system that gave you a title, a schedule, an email signature, a reason to get dressed in the morning, and a set of people who needed something from you every single day. That structure, as suffocating as it felt from the inside, was doing an enormous amount of psychological work that you were completely outsourcing to it without realizing it. It was telling you who you were. It was giving you a place in the social hierarchy. It was providing you with problems to solve, which gave you a sense of competence, which gave you a sense of self-worth. When that disappears overnight, the mind does not respond with relief. It responds with disorientation. The kind of disorientation that looks like freedom from the outside and feels like falling from the inside. And disoriented men make desperate decisions. They take the first opportunity that appears instead of the right one. They go back, not always to the same job, but to the same dynamic, the same power structure, just with a different logo on the building. They settle for something worse than what they left because the silence of having no structure became unbearable faster than they expected, and anything with walls and a schedule started to feel like rescue. The strategic exit does not eliminate this experience, but it compresses it. The man who has spent the weeks before his departure building his next structure, financially, socially, psychologically, hits that wall of silence and finds something on the other side of it. The man who quit impulsively hits that same wall and finds nothing. And the difference in what those two men do next is the difference between an exit that became a chapter and an exit that became a setback. Before you leave any institution, you are owed something, not severance, not a farewell lunch, not a LinkedIn recommendation, although get that too. Something worth considerably more than all of those things combined, and almost no one collects it before they walk out the door. Every position you have ever held inside an organization has given you access. Not just to the work itself, but to people, information, rooms, relationships, and systems that exist in your life only because of the role you occupy inside that structure. The client who takes your call because you represent the company. The senior figure in your industry who knows your name because you were introduced at a conference your employer paid for. The internal knowledge of how deals actually get done, how decisions actually get made, which vendors are reliable and which ones are disasters. Information that took years of proximity to accumulate and that has real market value the moment it lives in your head instead of in a company server. The moment you leave, that access ends, not gradually. Immediately. Your badge stops working. Your email gets deactivated or monitored. The chain of introductions that would have taken you one message to arrange now requires a cold outreach that may go unanswered for months. The rooms you walked into automatically now have doors you have to knock on. Most men walk out of jobs like they are escaping a place they hate. They want distance. They want to feel clean, unattached, free of the whole thing. And in wanting that feeling, they walk out of a room full of weapons and leave every single one of them on the floor. Before you announce anything, before a single person in that building knows you are leaving, you need to conduct a full audit of what that environment has given you that you have not yet fully used. Go through your contacts. Who in your professional network has more value to your next chapter outside that company than inside it? Which client relationships are genuinely personal enough to survive your departure if you invested in them now? Which colleague, the one who always seemed to be going somewhere, have you never properly connected with outside of work emails? What industry knowledge do you carry in your head that you have never written down, never organized, never converted into something you actually own? This is not corporate espionage. This is not theft. You are not taking anything that belongs to the institution. You are claiming what is already yours. The expertise your labor built, the relationships your personality maintained, the professional reputation your work created. Those things belong to you. They always did. But they expire the moment you stop being in the room, unless you move them first. The men who exit with the most power are rarely the most talented people in the building. They are the ones who understood, quietly and without announcing it, that their time inside that institution was always a temporary arrangement, and they spent that time accumulating things they could carry out. By the time they submitted their resignation, the job had already given them everything it had to offer. The letter was just the formality at the end of a transaction that had already completed. There is a window that opens the moment you decide to quit and closes the moment you announce it. Most men treat this window as dead time, the uncomfortable period between the decision and the declaration, where they feel like they are lying by, still showing up, still performing, still pretending everything is normal. They want to get through it as fast as possible, so they rush. They tell someone they trust at work. They start acting differently without realizing it. They let the news travel on its own before they are ready. This is the most expensive mistake of the entire exit. The silence window is not dead time. It is the most operationally valuable period of your professional life. Inside this window, you still have everything. Your title, your access, your credibility, your relationships completely intact. No one is looking at you differently yet. No one is calculating how to replace you, how to manage your departure, how to protect the institution from whatever damage your leaving might cause. You are still, as far as anyone knows, a permanent fixture. And that invisibility, that assumption of permanence, is a form of power that expires the second you open your mouth. This is when you make the introductions you have been putting off for months. This is when you have the coffees, the calls, the industry conversations that your current role made possible, but your future role will require. This is when you move things, relationships, knowledge, positioning, from inside the institution to outside it, in ways that are entirely professional and entirely irreversible. This is also when you build the financial architecture that will determine whether your exit is a strategy or a crisis. Machiavelli was precise on this point. A general who marches into new territory without supply lines already established is not courageous. He is reckless. And recklessness, in war as in personal finance, produces only one outcome, regardless of how justified the cause. You need to know with precision how many months you can operate at your current standard of living without a single dollar of new income, not an estimate. Not a rough calculation done in your head at 2 in the morning, an actual number based on actual expenses with a buffer built in for the expenses you forgot to account for. Because that number is the single most important variable in your exit. It determines how much time you have to be selective. It determines whether you exit as a man with options or as a man with a deadline. And deadlines make men desperate, and desperate men do not negotiate from power. The resignation letter is not a formality. It is a political document, and most men write it like they are filling out a form. 2 sentences of generic gratitude, a notice period, a signature, sent in a moment of relief with no thought given to who reads it, how it reads, what it sets in motion, or what it can be used for after the fact. They do not understand that the letter is the first public draft of the story of their departure. And stories, once they start circulating, take on a life entirely independent of the person they are about. The tone of the letter matters in ways that are not obvious. An overly warm letter, full of genuine-sounding gratitude and expressions of how much you valued the experience, reads as performance to anyone who knows the actual circumstances. People who watched you be underpaid, overlooked, or treated poorly for months read warmth in your exit letter and file it under dishonesty. It erodes your credibility with the very people whose respect you want to keep. On the other hand, a cold or clipped letter, 2 sentences, no warmth, just the legal minimum, reads as hostility. It gives the people who never liked you something to point to. It becomes the artifact they use to reframe your entire time at the company as someone who was always difficult, always resentful, just hiding it well. The letter that serves you is the one that is completely unremarkable. Professional without being performative. Brief without being blunt. Impossible to quote out of context because there is no context worth quoting. A document that generates no reaction whatsoever, which means it generates no story. Beyond the letter, the final weeks are a performance you are directing whether you know it or not. Every piece of work you deliver, every interaction you have, every conversation you choose to engage with or step back from, all of it is writing the final chapter of the version of you that remains in that building after you are physically gone. Because you do leave something behind. You always do. You leave a reputation that continues to operate in your absence. to speak for you in rooms you are no longer in, to either open doors or quietly close them in ways you will never directly observe but will absolutely feel. The man who delivers his best work in the final 2 weeks, who transitions his responsibilities cleanly, who says nothing that can be weaponized. That man leaves behind a version of himself that functions as a permanent asset. The man who checks out the moment the letter is sent, who becomes visibly disengaged, who lets slip what he really thought about the place. That man leaves behind a liability that will follow him for years in ways he will never be able to fully trace. Here is the thing no one says directly. Most men who quit are psychologically back within 18 months. Not in the same building necessarily, but back in the same dynamic, the same dependency, the same relationship with institutional structure that they thought they were escaping. They rebuild it somewhere else, sometimes for more money, sometimes for less, almost always with the same underlying feeling that they are still not quite free. And they cannot figure out why, because they did the thing. They made the move. They quit. The re-entry trap is not primarily a financial problem, although money running out accelerates it dramatically. It is a psychological infrastructure problem. The job was providing things you needed that had nothing to do with the paycheck. A sense of role, a daily sense of being useful, a social environment that required your presence, problems that needed your specific capability to solve. These are not luxuries. These are fundamental psychological requirements for a functioning human being. And the market does not automatically replace them when you hand in your notice. The men who navigate this successfully are not the ones with the largest savings accounts, although savings matter. They are the ones who built replacement infrastructure before they needed it. They found the work that made them feel capable before they left the job that made them feel trapped. They built the community before they lost the one that came with their title. They developed the identity that existed outside their professional role before they removed the professional role from the equation. If you quit without doing this, the silence will not feel like freedom. It will feel like erasure. And when a man feels erased, the instinct, powerful, almost irresistible, is to find the nearest structure willing to define him again. That instinct is what sends men back. Not a weakness of character, not failure of courage. Just the completely human need to be somewhere that knows your name and has a use for you. The last move is the one almost nobody makes, and it is the move that determines whether your exit becomes a footnote or a statement. It is the exit that makes them feel the loss after you are gone, not revenge. Revenge requires you to still be emotionally inside a building you physically left, and that is not power. That is attachment with a different label. This is something colder and more effective than revenge. This is the deliberate construction of an absence that costs them more than your presence ever did. It requires one thing above everything else: restraint in the final weeks. Complete, almost surgical restraint. Because the instinct when you have finally decided to leave, when you no longer care about the politics, when the performance of patience is no longer serving you, the instinct is to finally be honest, to let people know what you actually thought, to stop managing your reactions and let the real version of yourself occupy the space. Resist it entirely. The man who exits loudly, who makes his feelings known, who uses his final days as a platform for finally saying the things he held back, that man feels powerful for approximately one afternoon. Then he becomes a story. The institution absorbs his departure, processes his drama as confirmation of whatever narrative they had already built about him, replaces him, and moves on. His grievances become the reason no one takes his grievances seriously. The man who exits quietly, who delivers clean work until the last hour of the last day, who leaves no chaos, no unfinished business, no emotional residue, that man becomes something much more useful than a story. He becomes an absence with weight. The things he held together begin to show their seams. The relationships he maintained begin to drift without his attention. The institutional knowledge he carried begins to surface as gaps that nobody anticipated. And the people who took him for granted while he was there begin to ask, in the careful way that people ask things they do not want to admit needing to ask, what exactly was he doing that nobody else seems to be able to do? That question, appearing in a meeting he is not in, about work he is no longer responsible for, is worth more to his future than any exit speech he could have given. It is the sound of power relocating, quietly, completely, and entirely on his terms. Quitting is not the finish line. It never was. It is a move inside a game that started long before the resignation letter and will continue long after the final day. Most men make that move reactively, impulsively, with their emotions leading and their strategy nowhere to be found. And then they spend the next 2 years wondering why the freedom they chased feels so much like a different version of the same cage. The exit is a transaction. Everything you do in the weeks before, it determines the terms. The silence you keep, the assets you claim, the relationships you convert, the work you deliver, the narrative you write, all of it is negotiating the terms of a deal that most men do not even know they are in. The man who exits correctly does not look like he is escaping. He looks like he was always about to leave. That composure is not natural. It is not confidence in the motivational sense, not some internal peace he found through reflection. It is the specific, measurable result of preparation done quietly in the weeks before anyone else knew the decision had already been made. You know how it is built now. The question is whether you will use that knowledge before you need it or after.